Extras.
TDDC is always evolving, and while I'm still proud of the story of the early videos, the style and presentation are completely different between episode 1 and episode 7 or 8-ish, and between those and any of the more recent episodes. I'm constantly fighting between my top-level rational desire to use the experience I've gained and the better tools and techniques I have now to save time and make things faster, and my conflicting directorial vision, if you can call it that, the desire to push my creative limitations in terms of what I can show, draw, and animate. Another constant struggle is more of a script and tone one, and that is the balance between flow and narrative, and gameplay details. TDDC without gameplay details would be a weird, distorted sort of story, because the rules of the game and the abilities of the characters have a huge impact on their actions. But at the same time, describing every die roll and all the bonuses, especially earlier in the series, would have lost a lot of you guys who are not experienced or recent D&D players. I always figure that nearly everyone who sticks with and enjoys the series is some kind of gamer, but that's without defining or discriminating about what being a gamer means. I've always aimed to make it enjoyable to people who start the series with no specific knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons rules, and have it make sense even if you don't remember all the rules explanations from previous episodes. The thing is, occasionally, a lot hinges on a specific die roll, to the point that there's drama even in the bonuses and why that character has those bonuses. Far more often, the story flows better if we zoom back out, to the point that the specific combat actions, let alone the die rolls, are more of a distraction to the emotion or narrative of the adventure. I don't have any specific rule or any great way to figure this out. It's always a challenge. And I know that most of the time I should err on the side of less detail in combat, unless the players are making important decisions or jokes based on those details. But it's tough. Anyhow, all of this is to make the point that in recent episodes and going forward, I try to use the combat maps to illustrate and explain what's going on, but I'm often having to fudge the positioning of different characters and monsters from round to round, because getting it exactly right based on my audio notes and often incomplete documentation, it's just not worth the effort. The forensic analysis to be accurate down to a 5-foot square would take even more time for me and really doesn't make any worthwhile difference. This is why, with a few exceptions, I don't show the squares on the maps anymore. I try my best to get all the dimensions right on the rooms, but I can't figure out how X was within 5 feet of Y last round, and now they're over by Z, talking about their range. I'm just going to make the relationships between the map tokens try to make sense for what is currently happening, and not stress too much if I can't figure out exactly how they got to be that way. I'm still pretty annoyed that I can't find any files or paper maps of Polaron, because I'm pretty sure both existed. In fact, there should have been 2 paper copies, because I was drawing out a player version as they discovered it. There can be some benefit to making one of the players do the cartography, but I'd rather not have the confusion about who's doing what where, and the map is part of how I portray geometry, which in this case might be tricky to explain. And the overlapping bridges could get a little tricky, because even with me mapping my own dungeon, there was at least one place where I made enough of a mistake that in the audio notes I commented, "It's like an Escher diagram now." You may have, or probably didn't, notice some map shenanigans in the video too. I've been trying to use coloration to make it clear which bridge is the current level when moving around Polaron's many levels and overlapping bridges, so I tried to darken other bridges based on how far above or below the current level they are. But in a previous video, I had marked the core of the facility with a pyramid, similar to the cube at the base of Ginneron, because I found, particularly from the higher levels, that a dome down there, when you see only a fraction of it, looked really indistinct. But as we get closer to the bottom of the atrium, I decided that was not a great plan, because it was always actually a dome atop a cylinder, And having more time to think about it, I realized it would be more of a pain to omit all mention of the shape in future videos than just to change back to the real shape at this stage. It's a dome. One sticky issue was what to do about this, as of yet unknown, new unit. The PCs technically saw one guarding the controller's hallway before the aerial chase, and they got a good look at two more of them in the secondary armory. On both occasions, I did my best to describe the unit verbally, but without seeing them do anything. That description didn't seem to get across to the players what they were really looking at. So I had to seriously consider not using their proper tokens in the video yet, since obviously you guys, not having to imagine what the hell I was trying to describe, would realize much earlier than the party what kind of Battletech shit they might have to worry about. But that lack of clarity, that difficulty in describing it, is why the party has little, if any, reaction to the new unit throughout the video. It wasn't until the reveal at the end, pushing up that door, that combat with them appeared imminent, and that is when I just Googled Mad Cat and showed them an artist's impression of the large golems they were looking at. Fortunately, these are only large, not gargantuan like a real Battlemech would be. Fun fact, there's a point in the video when, referring to units which were shutting down or acting confused, I mentioned, this one's just rocking back and forth, indicating it with a circle. We don't get fancy proper miniatures for everything, even when using a map grid. We use whatever minis we have lying around, even use coins or other tokens to represent minions or other weak and numerous foes. In the video, that particular circle was drawn a little wide, so wide it kinda covers Liz as well, because for about 2 turns during the combat, I misidentified the miniature we were using. I thought it was a minion, but it was actually Liz. So I later had to clarify that Liz did not just rock back and forth. You may have noticed that Polaron controller wasn't all that helpful, even when they appeared to be on the same side, trying to stop the entity, as it called the Dark Ancient Warforged. A big part of this was that it was trying to put together conflicting information. Tactical information, where a group meeting their description was tearing through the facility's defenders, but then information from its strategic layer indicating active facility personnel investigating some of the laboratories, and appeared to have stopped the breach in the Eldritch Lab. At least, that was the optimistic interpretation. And after centuries and centuries of mundane operation, bereft of creators to assist and who could create new projects, the controller had now been fighting the steady, probing incursions of the entity over a period of weeks. This ancient artificial intelligence was not what you would call emotional, but under these circumstances it was suffering the equivalent of psychological stress, to the point that its thinking may have become biased in favor of hope. Nevertheless, giving a fair, some would say more than fair, chance to the unlikely possibility of new authorized personnel did not actually abate its concerns about the mysterious band of intruders with an undetermined relationship to the entity. Both having appeared within such a small time window, there had to be some connection. 2 to 4 weeks is like the blink of an eye after many uneventful centuries. So the controller considered each of their requests or commands from multiple perspectives, paying great consideration to the more pessimistic possibilities, but attempting to look for the positive to balance that. When the Dark Ancient's latest magma sifter body was shrieking down towards the armory and Little One called into the passage, it tried to seal the doors, but the entity just managed to slide in, and at that point, all the controller could do was have everything in the room attack whatever body the Dark Ancient currently inhabited. It doesn't really know how to kill a Dark Ancient, but it had observed that the entity could be driven off by accumulated damage, and, like the heroes most of the time, it figured its best hope was to keep smashing and hope it got lucky. The controller runs most of the units based on very high-level orders, like attack this, defend that, repair this, relying on their individual task or combat AI, because that's how the system is designed, allowing it to manage large numbers of constructs, though it is perfectly capable of giving much more specific instructions when there's good reason to. It simply takes more attention to do so. It also pays attention to the state of the Magitech machinery throughout the facility, paying attention to the movement, viscosity, and composition of the magma flows, and the status of the heat shields, power sources, etc. Interesting side note, though the Atarians put a lot of trust into these controllers, they knew that the more intelligence you craft in, the more effort has to be put into control structures, reinforcing the imperatives to protect personnel, etc. And even then, Polaron controller in particular, having to manage the intensely dangerous power of the molten rock flowing around it, was hardwired in such a way that there is a minimum energy level devoted to the heat protection systems of those bridges. The controller is literally incapable of cutting power to the heat shielding unless its power levels are so low that it's a choice between its own consciousness and the heat shields. And even then, the only reason they would allow it to gain full control over bridge power is because if the controller shuts down, the bridges would shut down anyway. Its responsibility in such an emergency is to choose which heat shields go down first in order to save as many lives as possible. But short of such a worst-case scenario, the control does not have the ability to, for example, drop the shielding on the top bridge deliberately to wipe out an invading force. So what can the controller do then? In my notes, I outlined a specific set of actions the Polaron controller can take by focusing on a unit or area. It can only do one of these things per round, and some of these actions have cooldowns. Note also that the controller has vision in a number of areas, but is otherwise dependent on the vision of its constructs. Further, it does not have vision or direct awareness of a construct under the control of a Dark Ancient, so it must detect them in other ways. You can use door focus, which diverts energy to increase the lock DC and hardness of a single door by 10. The main corridors have doors a foot thick, 15 hardness, and 80 hit points per small creature-sized hole. No cooldown. Golem Override. By consciously micromanaging their defenses, the controller protects all golems in a 25-foot radius area from any kind of control or subversion. Gives the golems in question plus 15 to all saving throws, making it a losing proposition for a Dark Ancient to try and take over, for example. Generally, the controller will only trigger this when it has good reason, such as if defenders are suffering a repeated spamming of the same bad spell, or if a Dark Ancient has been detected. There's no cooldown on this ability, but of course it has to its focus every round in order to maintain that. You can do a Golem Reboot. One target golem, not currently mind-controlled, spends one round rebooting and frees itself from all buffs and debuffs. This ability can restore golems in the empty state. It results when a Dark Ancient leaves them. It has a cooldown of 1 minute. You can do a Magic Surge, which bathes 4 contiguous 10 by 10 cubes in energy, giving all living creatures in that area 1d4 charges. These charges are manipulated by some golems. Magic charges dissipate if the creature does not gain a new charge for 3 rounds. That has a cooldown of 1 minute. That's one I should have used a couple more times. It would have been fun. But you can also project a security force field to block a corridor. It must be completely vertical, anchored to a wall on both sides and perpendicular to the hall. The force field lasts for 3 rounds and has a cooldown of 10 minutes. Or the force field can be projected in a specific spot in the hallway leading to the controller with no cooldown, though this does not allow it to force field 2 places at once. I feel like it should have used some of these a little more, but again, the confusion described above and the discord between the tactical and strategic layers of its intelligence meant it was rarely fully engaged against the party, even when they were in combat with its units. Frankly, by the end of this video, it was spending a lot of effort maintaining the force field in front of itself to prevent it or its guard units from possession. As you've probably heard by now, my Patreon patrons get the extras about a week early, giving them a chance to ask additional questions about this or prior episodes. Christian Hoy Horsberg asks, at some point the players refer to Polaron controller as she? Do controllers actually identify with a gender, or is that just for convenience? I didn't do a fabulous job of this in the videos or at the table, but they're dealing with 2 disembodied construct entities throughout the dungeon, so, although really they're both genderless, the theory was to identify the Dark Ancient using male pronouns and the controller using female ones to make it more clear who they are talking to or talking about. Also, what I really wanted for Polaron Controller's voice, though it wasn't practical for me or for Arestria, and it was a ridiculous amount of dialogue to send off to Arestria and then have me get picky about it. And yeah, ideally, I wanted it to sound like GLaDOS. And I described it that way once or twice at the table, but as much as it would have been awesome for the video, it would have been too hard to pull off. Danny Masters asked, what was the controller's plan to deal with Alpha? Maybe it was just the players messing with the plan, but it seemed like the controller was losing. The controller hadn't devised any effective strategy to actually defeat the entity, but it was fending him off pretty well. Each time he would show up, he would destroy a golem, jump into another one, do some more damage, but as long as the golems were in groups of 4 or more, there was almost no way for him to get away without suffering some damage, and although Dark Ancients suffer only a fraction of the damage their bodies take, they heal very slowly, over days. So the deeper he would penetrate into Polaron, the more time he needed to recover before the next incursion, and between the facility's repair abilities and the controller's Golem reboot feature, usually all damaged or possessed units could be restored before the next incursion, except whichever one the entity walked out with. The Dark Ancient could make some incremental progress, causing some amount of damage to other systems. He's been taking out the controller's sensors, forcing it to rely more and more on just the vision from the units themselves, or other trouble which might not be repaired fast enough, but it was very slow progress. Until the PCs started trashing units at a much faster rate. I want to give a huge thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons who put up with the multiple month wait for TDDC 40. They got to watch this video about a week early, giving them a chance to ask questions like the above, though there were always room for more. Thanks so much for your continued support, with a special shout out to Gander, Pericles, Sildari, Lord Aben, and Tyranno MCG, the members of the organization. And if you can't afford to contribute financially, or just don't feel like it, remember, it doesn't cost you a dime to like and share Tales from My D&D campaign.